so many people there that could have and should have been interviewed. Like the unnamed aide to Mark Meadows, who thought people were going to get killed. Did Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, communicate those concerns to Trump? What was Trump's reaction to those concerns? Mark Meadows himself could provide those answers. Then apparently Kellyanne Conway reportedly talked to Trump. What happened in that conversation? How about sending a subpoena to Ivanka and or Jared, who probably wouldn't cooperate, but that doesn't mean that you don't send them a subpoena anyway. They also listed Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Ben Sasse. Who were the White House officials that Ben Sasse talked to who said that Trump was surprised that others weren't delighted? Both of these guys are senators. They were in the room. They're not hard to find. Same with Senator Tommy Tuberville. What did Trump say to him when he called him? Kevin McCarthy, what did Trump say to him? The House Impeachment Managers passed up the opportunity to talk to any and all of those people. They didn't collect any firsthand evidence. They didn't do their own interviews. They used media sources, and they didn't verify that those sources were correct.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 228th episode of Congressional Dish, the second impeachment of Donald J. Trump. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, hello, I'm Jennifer Briney. And I've been closely watching Congress now for the better part of a decade, reading bills and laws, watching hearings, and now impeachment trials, and sharing what I find from the perspective of just a regular taxpayer who thinks that someone should be watching what the most powerful people in the country do, and not just in order to predict the results of whatever election is coming up next. I'm not a member of any political party, and that has definitely bitten me in the ass countless times and is surely to bite me in the ass again today, because there is no way that I can win with party loyalists when the topic of the day is the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. I learned this from the first impeachment, and here we go again. Because for this episode, my husband and I spent an entire weekend watching the entire trial. And to tell you the truth, I'm actually glad that I did, because originally I wasn't going to create this episode. But Congressional Dish producers asked me to watch it and summarize it, and the experience of listening to the entire case was very different from what I feel like the buzz indicated, which, at least in my media experience, seemed to conclude that the Democrats presented a rock-solid, compelling case, and that the Republicans, acting as tribal Trump loyalists, protected Trump with their votes to acquit him. And as usual, the situation was far more nuanced once I examined it in detail for myself, and I'll show you what I mean by that today. But before I get started, I just want to give you a little note about the show notes, because usually when I am presenting sound clips from something that is very long, mainly hearings, I give you timestamps. But everything that took place in the trial actually took place on the Senate floor, which means that we have transcripts in the congressional record. And so instead of the timestamps, I gave you the PDFs to those transcripts instead. And all you have to do to find the clips and hear them or read them in context is download those PDFs and then use the search function to find the clip. You know, find a couple words in order, search for that, and you'll pretty easily find the clips. This is how I do it. Usually takes under a minute. So just that little change from how we usually do things in the show notes. But I feel like the show notes are the most important thing that I do, because I don't expect you to take my word for any of this. I want to make it as easy as possible for you to check my work. And especially with sound clips, I think you should be able to go and find them and hear them in context, because in order to create a show like this, I do have to do editing. And so I want you to be able to easily figure out if my edits were fair. And so if you like that I bother to give you sources so that you can check them for yourself, because everyone seems to be full of shit lately, and so at least I attempt to earn your trust. Well, if you appreciate that, please pay whatever you think is fair for this show, because the business model for this show, which is my full-time job, is based on creating a show for you, not a show created to sell your time to advertisers. And if you do pay for the show, that gives you, as a producer, access to the producers only green room, which has golf swing free versions of all public episodes for those of you who like to hear the profanity fly. And it also has some bonus producers only stuff. Now, the easiest and fastest way to get access to that is to pledge whatever you think is fair per episode on Patreon. That gives you immediate access to the green room feed. But if you want to pay with PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, paper checks, whatever you want, that's fine too. Just to get your green room feed, you have to pay and then give us your email address somehow, and then we will send you instructions for setting up your personal feed and in most podcast apps. But that takes a few days because we're a small operation over here, and so my sister and I have to manually get those feeds sent out. But the reason I'm saying this right now is that there is some bonus green room episodes waiting for producers that is directly connected to this episode, because husband Joe and I, like I said, watched almost the entire trial together while collecting sound clips and commenting and for a little while drinking whiskey. But the only part of the trial that wasn't in the green room was day one. And that's the day that they debated whether the trial itself was constitutional. And I watched that by myself. But all of the evidence discussing days, Joe and I watched it together. And so the episodes together are over 14 hours long. It's like a Mystery Science Theater 3000 type of thing, and it's super raw. So you essentially get to experience watching the trial with us as we were on the couch, and you can hear for yourself my progression towards my conclusions about this trial. But obviously, that's bonus because I'm going to summarize my take on the trial for you right now. And this episode is going to have more of my opinion in it than usual because I have to judge what I consider to be fair and true in order to tell you the big picture about the trial. Because unlike the first impeachment, which had weeks worth of hearings and evidence gathering to sort through, we know all the evidence here because we watched the riot on television. We heard Trump's speech, or at least Congressional Dish listeners have heard it. And if you haven't, I'll play what you need to hear in this episode. But in this trial, it really wasn't about discovering evidence that we weren't aware of. This was about judgment. And so I'm giving you mine today because you already know what happened. What you don't know is how what you saw that day was presented in the trial. And I think you should. But for the people who have been COVID cowering in the mountains without access to civilization and are just now returning, first of all, welcome back. But this trial that I'm talking about was focused on the events of one day, January 6th, 2021. On that day, a mob of President Donald Trump's supporters, most of whom had just attended a rally he hosted walking distance from the Capitol building, charged through thin police lines, broke into the Capitol building, and interrupted the certification of the results of the 2020 election, the election that Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, won for the office of the President of the United States. Now, I explained that certification process and summarized what happened during that certification in a very recent episode, and that was the lame duck episode of Congressional Dish. It was just a couple episodes ago. So listen to that to go deep on this. But basically, the certification in Congress is mainly a formality. The real deadline for counting the votes was December 14th, when the states had to certify their electors. January 6th was just Congress counting those votes. But regardless of the fact that this was the wrong date and event to attempt to stop the real certification, the Capitol was stormed by people trying to do just that. The question in the trial, though, was, did Donald Trump incite those people to do that? And let's not bury the lead here because we all know how the trial ended. Here's Senator Patrick Leahy. He was basically presiding over the entire trial. He was like the judge.
It is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
7 Republican senators joined the 50 Democrats to convict Donald Trump on the charge of incitement of insurrection. But the standard for conviction and impeachment isn't majority rule. It had to be 2/3 of the Senate, which would be 67 senators. And so 57 wasn't enough, and Trump was found officially not guilty. Within minutes of the votes, right after it, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, who voted to acquit Donald Trump and encouraged other Senate Republican sheep to do the same, well, this is what he said about the trial that had just ended.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he'd lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty. The House accused the former president of, quote, incitement. That is a specific term from the criminal law. Let me just put that aside for a moment and reiterate something I said weeks ago. There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. The issue is not only the president's intemperate language on January 6th. It is not just his endorsement of remarks in which an associate urged, quote, trial by combat. It was also the entire manufactured atmosphere of looming catastrophe, the increasingly wild myths about a reverse landslide election that was somehow being stolen, some secret coup by our now president. Now, I defended the president's right to bring any complaints to our legal system. The legal system spoke. The Electoral College spoke. As I stood up and said clearly at that time, the election was settled. It was over. But that just really opened a new chapter of even wilder, and more unfounded claims. The leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things. Now, sadly, many politicians sometimes make overheated comments or use metaphors. We saw that unhinged listeners might take literally, but that was different. That's different from what we saw. This was an intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined to either overturn the voters' decision or else torch our institutions on the way out. The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence actually began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce by that afternoon, we know he was watching the same live television as the rest of us. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one who could. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. The president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. No. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Now, even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in serious danger, even as the mob, carrying Trump banners, was beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his own vice president. Now, predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seem to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence, not surprisingly. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace, he didn't call right away for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals.
And so, if that's the way he feels about Donald Trump's behavior, why did Mitch McConnell and many other Republicans say that they voted not guilty?
If President Trump were still in office, I would have carefully considered whether the House managers proved their specific charge. By the strict criminal standard, the president's speech probably was not incitement. However, in the context of impeachment, the Senate might have decided this was acceptable shorthand for the reckless actions that preceded the riot. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction. Now, this is a close question, no doubt. Donald Trump was the president when the House voted, though not when the House chose to deliver the papers. Brilliant scholars argue both sides of this jurisdictional question. The text is legitimately ambiguous. I respect my colleagues who've reached either conclusion. But after intense reflection, I believe the best constitutional reading shows that Article 2, Section 4, exhausts the set of persons who can legitimately be impeached, tried, or convicted. It's the president, it's the vice president, and civil officers. We have no power to convict and disqualify a former office holder who is now a private citizen.
And that is, in my educated opinion, a steaming pile of bullshit. Because on day one, the Senate actually voted on whether or not the trial was constitutional, and the vote ended up 56-44, with 6 Republicans joining all Democrats to rule that the trial was in fact constitutional. A vote tally that was only one off from the final acquittal vote. But that vote was way too close because the precedent explained by the House Impeachment Managers on day one was, to steal the word tossed around so much in the corporate media, it was compelling. And so let's start with the lead impeachment manager, constitutional law professor, Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
And there can be no doubt that the Senate has the power to try this impeachment. We know this because Article 1, Section 3 gives the Senate the sole power to try all impeachments. The Senate has the power, the sole power, to try all impeachments. All means all, and there are no exceptions to the rule. Because the Senate has jurisdiction to try all impeachments, it most certainly has jurisdiction to try this one.
But does that apply to impeachments of officials who have since left office? The Constitution doesn't really say anything about that, but the impeachments from before, during, and after the Constitution's creation say a lot, starting with the days of the founders.
The first point comes from English history, which matters because, as Hamilton wrote, England provided the model from which the idea of this institution has been borrowed. And it would have been immediately obvious to anyone familiar with that history that former officials could be held accountable for their abuses while in office. Every single impeachment of a government official that occurred during the framers' lifetime concerned a former official.
And so that was the model they were using to write the Constitution. And impeachment was an issue while they were writing the Constitution.
Indeed, the most famous of these impeachments occurred while the framers gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution. It was the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the former Governor General of the British colony of Bengal, and a corrupt guy. The framers knew all about it, and they strongly supported the impeachment. In fact, the Hastings case was invoked by name at the convention. It was the only specific impeachment case that they discussed at the convention. It played a key role in their adoption of the high crimes and misdemeanors standard. And even though everyone there surely knew that Hastings had left office 2 years before his impeachment trial began, not a single framer, not one, raised a concern when Virginian George Mason held up the Hastings impeachment as a model for us in the writing of our Constitution.
Then there's the precedent set after the Constitution was ratified. And so this isn't British history. This isn't like the founding fathers in the middle of writing the Constitution. This is our history. So here's Representative Joe Neguse of Colorado.
Let's start with the precedent, with what has happened in this very chamber. I'd like to focus on just 2 cases. I'll go through them quickly. One of them is the nation's very first impeachment case, which actually was of a former official. In 1797, about a decade after our country had ratified our Constitution, there was a senator from Tennessee by the name of William Blount who was caught conspiring with the British to try to sell Florida and Louisiana. Ultimately, President Adams caught him. He turned over the evidence to Congress. 4 days later, the House of Representatives impeached him. A day after that, this body, the United States Senate, expelled him from office. So he was very much a former official. Despite that, the House went forward with its impeachment proceeding in order to disqualify him from ever again holding federal office. And so the Senate proceeded with the trial, with none other than Thomas Jefferson presiding. Now, Blount argued that the Senate couldn't proceed because he had already been expelled. But here's the interesting thing. He expressly disavowed any claim that former officials can't ever be impeached. I mean, unlike President Trump, he was very clear that he respected and understood that he could not even try to argue that ridiculous position. Even impeached Senator Blount recognized the inherent absurdity of that view. Here's what he said. I certainly never shall contend that an officer may first commit an offense and afterwards avoid by resigning his office. That's the point. And there was no doubt because the founders were around to confirm that that was their intent and the obvious meaning of what is in the Constitution.
And then on top of that, there's this story.
William Belknap. I'm not going to go into all the details, but just in short, in 1876, the House discovered that he was involved in a massive kickback scheme. Hours before the House committee that discovered this conduct released its report documenting the scheme, Belknap literally rushed to the White House to resign, tender his resignation to President Ulysses Grant, to avoid any further inquiry into his misconduct, and of course, to avoid being disqualified from holding federal office in the future. Well, later that day, aware of the resignation, what did the House do? The House moved forward and unanimously impeached him, making clear its power to impeach a former official. And when his case reached the Senate, this body, Belknap made the exact same argument that President Trump is making today, that you all lack jurisdiction, any power to try him because he's a former official. Now, many senators at that time, when they heard that argument, literally they were sitting in the same chairs you all are sitting in today. They were outraged by that argument. Outraged. You can read their comments in the record. They knew it was a dangerous argument with dangerous implications. It would literally mean that a president could betray their country, leave office, and avoid impeachment and disqualification entirely. And that's why, in the end, the United States Senate decisively voted that the Constitution required them to proceed with the trial.
That precedent is pretty damn clear. And in response to that, here's the most coherent argument made by Donald Trump's lawyer. This is David Schoen.
Presidents are impeachable because presidents are removable. Former presidents are not, because they cannot be removed. The Constitution is clear. Trial by the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment is reserved for the President of the United States, not a private citizen who used to be President of the United States. Just as clear, the judgment required upon conviction is removal from office, and a former president can no longer be removed from office.
But if that were true, those other impeachments couldn't have unfolded the way they did. They couldn't have even happened. Removal is only one part. There's also conviction, which can lead to disqualification for regaining power in the future. Here's Representative Joe Neguse of Colorado again.
And just imagine the consequences of such an absurd interpretation of the Constitution. I mean, if President Trump were right about that language, then officials could commit the most extraordinary, destructive offenses against the American people, high crimes and misdemeanors. They'd have total control over whether they can ever be impeached, and if they are, whether the Senate can try the case. If they want to escape any public inquiry into their misconduct or the risk of disqualification from future office, then it's pretty simple. They could just resign 1 minute before the House impeaches, or even 1 minute before the Senate trial, or they could resign during the Senate trial if it's not looking so well. That would effectively erase disqualification from the Constitution. It would put wrongdoers in charge of whether the Senate can try them.
And all Trump's lawyers could say in response to that was, here's Bruce Castor, Trump's lawyer.
I mean, let's understand why we are really here. We are really here because the majority in the House of Representatives does not want to face Donald Trump as a political rival in the future. That's the real reason we're here.
Which may be politically true. But the precedent for impeaching former officials, those examples, I cannot fathom how any neutral observer could see this as anything other than a clear, decisive win for the Democrats. Because former officials have been impeached and tried in the Senate in our past, during the lifetimes of the founders. The founders did it! And the founders wrote the Constitution, so they wouldn't have let those impeachments move forward if they weren't allowed. And so Mitch McConnell and the Republicans that voted like him, you know, for me, for this to be his public reason for the acquittal, assuming he means it, I really don't like the way he just ignored those crystal clear precedents. Former officials have been impeached and tried since the founding of our country, in fact, by the founders. And so to say it's not allowed? What? And this is just one more reason on top of so many reasons that I would really like for Mitch McConnell to be voted out of the Senate as soon as possible, or at the very least, be kept from ever controlling it again. Because if he's being honest that this was his reason, then he totally ignored the clear intent of the founders based on their actions. And if what he says is just a cover for his real reason for acquitting Trump, then he's a liar. Both of those are bad. And a lot of Republicans use the same cover story for their acquittal votes, which sets up an ugly precedent for disqualifying law-breaking government officials from regaining their power in the future. And so long term, this is how this impeachment trial is going to matter the most as we go forward in U.S. history. But you can see why selfish Republican cowards would want to peg their votes to the legitimacy of the trial itself instead of pegging their votes to actually casting judgment upon Donald Trump. Because even though this was a perfect opportunity for the Republicans to rid their party of the Donald Trump cancer, they didn't. And avoiding the subject of his culpability altogether is an easier route here for the Republican senators who are afraid of his wrath. And so the fact is that Donald Trump remains, because of his acquittal, a viable candidate for another 4 years in power as president of the United States, despite all we saw him do, all the anti-democratic actions that Mitch McConnell, of all people, listed. And so now let's look at the substance of the trial, because Donald Trump has escaped congressional accountability for his actions. But it wasn't just the Republicans' fault. So in the aftermath of January 6th, the Democrats, led by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, wanted Vice President Pence to get together with the rest of Trump's cabinet and use their powers to remove Trump immediately from office, which Vice President Pence refused to do. And so 5 days after the riot and the election certification, the Democrats filed their article of impeachment. And 2 days after that, exactly 1 week after the riot, they voted to impeach Donald Trump in the full House of Representatives. It was the fastest impeachment of a president in United States history, completely skipping the step where the Judiciary Committee usually collects evidence and writes the article of impeachment. In this case, the single article of impeachment filed, written by the Democratic Party leaders, was for incitement of insurrection. In the article, it says, quote, "On January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There, he reiterated false claims that
we won this election and we won it by a landslide.
He also willfully made statements that, in context, encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as,
"We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore."
Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the vice president, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts, unquote. The impeachment article also says, quote, "President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021 followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results and threatened Secretary Raffensperger if he failed to do so," unquote. Now, in the lame duck episode, I played you clips from that 1 hour and 15-minute phone call in order, and it tells quite the tale. It added up to about 7 minutes, and so I'm not going to play the whole thing again because that's too long. But here are a few highlights, or lowlights, however you want to think about it.
If we could just go over some of the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia, but we've had hundreds of thousands of ballots that we're able to actually will get you a pretty accurate number. You don't need much of a number because the number that in theory I lost by the margin would be 11,779. And even if you cut them in half, cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
And you will find you will be at 11,779 within minutes. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country, because, so what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
He clearly tried to get the Georgia Secretary of State to alter the vote counts just enough so that the state would be flipped to him. His words. There's just no way that behavior is okay. But because the article of impeachment centered around the riot and not the attempt to flip the election to himself, the main focus of the evidence was the speech that then President Trump gave to the crowd on January 6th. Now, the Democrats played clips from that speech over and over and over again. but they left some key parts of the speech out. And so instead of playing what they provided, I'm going to play you the montage that I made for the lame duck episode because I didn't cherry pick. This has almost all the relevant stuff played by both the prosecutors and the defense.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. Today, I will lay out just some of the evidence proving that we won this election, and we won it by a landslide. This was not a close election. You know, I say sometimes jokingly, but there's no joke about it. I've been in 2 elections. I won them both, and the second one, I won much bigger than the first, okay? Because we're going to have somebody in there that should not be in there, and our country will be destroyed, and we're not going to stand for that. But this year, using the pretext of the China virus and the scam of mail-in ballots, Democrats attempted the most brazen and outrageous election theft. And there's never been anything like this. It's a pure theft in American history. Everybody knows it. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. Because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution. Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. Lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. As in other years, there should have been approximately 45,000 ballots rejected, far more than what we needed to win, just over 11,000. They should find those votes. They should absolutely find that. Just over 11,000 votes, that's all we need. They defrauded us out of a win in Georgia, and we're not going to forget it because they want to steal the election. The radical left knows exactly what they're doing. They're ruthless, and it's time that somebody did something about it. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now. Make no mistake, this election was stolen from you, from me, and from the country. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give. The Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much.
And here's what Trump's lawyer, Michael Van der Veen, said about that speech.
Consider the language that the House impeachment article alleges to constitute incitement. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. This is ordinary political rhetoric that is virtually indistinguishable from the language that has been used by people across the political spectrum for hundreds of years.
And to back that up, his lawyers then played a very, very long montage of the clips of Senate Democrats saying fight over and over again, which was so ballsy to make a montage of people sitting in the room as jurors saying very similar words to Donald Trump and playing it to their faces. You could feel a "fuck you guys" vibe set in after that montage was played. But the defense did make their point. But the most impactful part of their defense about the content of Trump's speech was a clip that they played that didn't make it into my montage. And here it is.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them, we're gonna let you know who they are. I can already tell you, frankly.
The House's case is built around how the bumpkins interpreted Trump's words, and they focused on the word fight. It was so repetitive. But the real question is how those words were intended by Donald Trump. And in this context, he was clearly talking about an electoral fight. He didn't tell the crowd to hang Mike Pence. He said, if Mike Pence doesn't come through for us, it will, quote, be a sad day for our country, unquote. He also said that if Mike Pence didn't do what he wants, he said, quote, I'm going to be very disappointed in you, unquote. In you. He wasn't even directing that speech at the crowd at that point. He was speaking to Mike Pence. He was pushing for Mike Pence to act. And as for the Capitol, Donald Trump didn't tell that crowd to kidnap the entire Congress. He didn't even tell them to enter the building. He said, quote, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, unquote. Not storm the Capitol, not enter the Capitol. His words show that he intended to incite a march. He also said, quote, we're going to cheer on, unquote, members of Congress, not murder members of Congress or kidnap members of Congress or injure members of Congress. He said we're going to cheer them on. That's an act of using voices, not weapons, not violence. And backing that up is the part of the speech that was willfully ignored by the House Impeachment Managers. Quote, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, unquote. And then at the end of the speech, his final call to action was, quote, we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, unquote. And he said that the purpose was to give Republicans, quote, the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country, unquote. Which is Trump gibberish. But there was no explicit call to violence. And I was definitely looking for it because I never want Donald Trump to be the president of the United States again. But you have to be fair here. As for his intent, the speech indicates that Donald Trump clearly wanted to influence the actions of Vice President Mike Pence and other members of Congress to affect their counting of the votes. The rally turned into a riot was a means to that end. The goal wasn't a riot. But did he incite the riot in order to further his goal of flipping the election? Well, to determine if he incited that riot, is he guilty of the incitement part? Considering that there was no explicit request for violence in his speech, that means that his behavior before and during the riot is important. Because the preparations he made as the head law enforcement officer in this country, and then his actions in regards to stopping it, those are indicators of intent. And so first, did Donald Trump do anything to prevent the Capitol Police from being properly prepared on January 6th? Well, according to Chris Miller, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, in an interview he gave to Vanity Fair, Donald Trump asked the Defense Secretary how many troops the Pentagon planned to have on the streets of Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Now, I'm going to be quoting the Defense Secretary here because he told Vanity Fair, quote, we're going to provide any National Guard support that the district requests. And Trump goes, you're going to need 10,000 people. No, I'm not talking bullshit. He said that. And we're like, maybe, but someone's going to have to ask for it, unquote. Trump then told the Defense Secretary, quote, you do what you need to do, unquote. Which, if true, indicates that Donald Trump tried to protect the Capitol ahead of time. Because instead of the 10,000 law enforcement officers that Chris Miller said Trump recommended, the Capitol Police had fewer than 2,000 officers, which clearly wasn't enough. If Chris Miller told Vanity Fair the truth, then the Capitol would have been better protected had the defense secretary listened to Trump. Which means that Trump did not invoke his presidential powers to make it easy for the mob to enter the Capitol. He did the opposite. He tried to get more troops on the streets on January 6th. And so what about the other end? When Donald Trump knew the riot was happening, did he invoke his power in any way to slow down or prevent a law enforcement response? And the fact of the matter is, as of right now, we still don't really know because the Democrats never bothered to find out. Defense Secretary Chris Miller wasn't ever interviewed by the House Impeachment Managers, even though the Vanity Fair article was released weeks before the trial. Similarly, Major General William Walker, the commanding general of the D.C. National Guard, was never interviewed to tell us why the National Guard troops were delayed, since he was in charge of sending them. And that's far from the end of the list of people with critical information who were not heard from, because no witnesses were interviewed. And so even though I watched every second of the trial, I don't feel like I know any more today than I did 2 weeks ago about what happened on January 6th. The House Impeachment Managers just repeated back to me what I already knew with some new boring CCTV videos from inside the Capitol mixed in with public riot footage. First of all, they never interviewed Trump, the subject of their trial. Here's House Impeachment Manager David Cicilline.
There was a lot of discussion yesterday about what the president knew and when he knew it. There are certain things that we do not know about what the president did that day, because the president, that is former President Trump, has remained silent about what he was doing during one of the bloodiest attacks on our Capitol since 1812. Despite a full and fair opportunity to come forward, he's refused to come and tell his story.
But then they never sent him a subpoena to force him to answer questions, probably because Trump would challenge it in court and that would take time to work itself out. And obviously, they didn't want to wait. But then there were plenty of other people who could have been sent a subpoena too, who could have told us what Trump was up to during the riot. Here is House Impeachment Manager Representative Joaquin Castro.
An aide to Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, urged his boss to go see the president, saying, quote, "They are going to kill people."
Here's David Cicilline.
Those around Donald Trump, as was later reported, were disgusted. His close aides, his advisors, those working for him, former officials, even his family were begging him to do something. Kellyanne Conway, the president's close advisor, called to, quote, add her name to the chorus of aides urging Donald Trump to take action. Ivanka Trump, the president's own daughter, went to the Oval Office as soon as the rioting escalated and was, as confirmed by Senator Graham, quote, trying to get Trump to speak out, to tell everyone to leave, end quote. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy called Jared Kushner, pleading with him to persuade Trump to issue a statement or to do something. And Kushner, too, went down to the White House after that call. And it wasn't just the people at the White House. Members of Congress from both parties who were trapped here were calling the White House to ask for help.
Here's David Cicilline again.
Senator Ben Sasse relayed a conversation with senior White House officials that President Trump was, quote, walking around the White House, confused about why other people on his team weren't as excited as he was, end quote.
Oh, and there's more.
The president, as reported by sources, at the time was delighted. As he watched the violence unfold on television, President Trump was reportedly, and I quote, borderline enthusiastic because it meant the certification was being derailed, end quote.
So many people there that could have and should have been interviewed. Like the unnamed aide to Mark Meadows who thought people were going to get killed. Did Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, communicate those concerns to Trump? What was Trump's reaction to those concerns? Mark Meadows himself could provide those answers. Then apparently Kellyanne Conway reportedly talked to Trump. What happened in that conversation? How about sending a subpoena to Ivanka and or Jared, who probably wouldn't cooperate, but that doesn't mean that you don't send them a subpoena anyway. They also listed Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Ben Sasse. Who were the White House officials that Ben Sasse talked to who said that Trump was surprised that others weren't delighted? Both of these guys are senators. They were in the room. They're not hard to find. Same with Senator Tommy Tuberville. What did Trump say to him when he called him? Kevin McCarthy, what did Trump say to him? You know, these are people in Congress. You know where they work. You just have to take a microphone over to them and do an interview. It's not hard. And you know what? How about you get the names of those unnamed sources who told the unnamed journalist that Trump was loving the whole thing? You know, what the kind of evidence is that? I mean, since January 20th, Joe Biden has been in charge at the White House. He's been the president. And so all they had to do was ask Joe Biden to hand over the White House call list from January 6th. Who did Trump talk to that day? Get the list and call him up. Because Trump wasn't in a room alone for those hours. There were people who were interacting with him who could tell us what he said and what he did during that riot. And the testimony could have been must-see TV because, for example, I would have loved to have heard from whatever unnamed person reported this conversation between Mike Pence and Donald Trump. This is House Impeachment Manager Ted Lieu.
You can either go down in history as a patriot, Mr. Trump told him, according to two people briefed on the conversation, or you can go down in history as a pussy.
I really do hope we get to hear secret recordings from behind closed doors in the Trump White House someday, because the things that man says. But back to being all serious. The point I'm trying to make here is that the House Impeachment Managers passed up the opportunity to talk to any and all of those people. And at the end of their presentation, senators from both parties clearly felt like this was a key part of the equation that was missing. Here's a question that was submitted by Republican Senator Susan Collins.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? What specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
And here's a question that was co-submitted by Democratic Senators Ed Markey and Tammy Duckworth.
Exactly when did the president learn of the breach at the Capitol? And what steps did he take to address the violence? Please be as detailed as possible.
And here's the Democrats' answer. Here is House Impeachment Manager Stacey Plaskett.
Mr. President, Senators, this attack was on live TV, on all major networks in real time. The president, as president, has access to intelligence information, including reports from inside the Capitol. He knew the violence that was underway. He knew the severity of the threats. And most importantly, he knew the Capitol Police were overwhelmingly outnumbered and in a fight for their lives against thousands of insurgents with weapons. We know he knew that. We know that he did not send any individuals. We did not hear any tweets. We did not hear him tell those individuals, stop. This is wrong. You must go back. We did not hear that. So what else did the president do? We are unclear. But we believe it was a dereliction of his duty. And that was because he was the one who had caused them to come to the Capitol. And they were doing what he asked them to do. So there was no need for him to stop them from what they were engaged in.
What did the president do? It's unclear. They don't know what President Trump was watching on television. They don't know that President Trump was even watching television. They don't know what he was doing. They don't know. And that is inexcusable. Because by its own convincing argument, the House Democrats said that they have the ability, they have the right to impeach a former official, which means that there was no legal reason to rush the impeachment proceedings. Even if they felt it was super important to impeach Trump before he left office, they impeached him on January 13th. There were still 7 more days of the Trump administration. They had extra days, plenty of time to at least to have held a hearing or two. And then during the time period between January 20th, when the new administration began, and February 9th, when the impeachment trial began, that was 20 days that they could have held hearings or done interviews or collected any kind of evidence that could have been used in the trial. Instead, those hearings are just starting to take place now, a week after the trial is finished. The part where they gather evidence and interview people in hearings didn't need to be skipped. And this was something that was definitely brought up by Trump's lawyers. Here's Bruce Castor.
Several of my colleagues at the House Managers got up and spoke about the proceeding in the House being like a grand jury proceeding. Well, I've been in grand jury proceedings. I have run grand juries. In grand jury proceedings, you call witnesses. You hear evidence. You make transcripts. You take affidavits. You develop physical evidence. You hear reports from police officers. You hear forensic analysis from scientists. In fact, you invite the target of the grand jury to come in and testify if he or she pleases to be heard by the grand jury. Which one of those things happened in the House prior to the impeachment article?
None of them. Not a single one. But even though they didn't do their homework before the trial, the House Impeachment Managers were then granted a gift right before the end of the trial. This is from the last morning of the trial. This is Representative Jamie Raskin.
But last night, Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler of Washington State issued a statement confirming that in the middle of the insurrection, when House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy called the president to beg for help, President Trump responded, and I quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are." Needless to say, this is an additional critical piece of corroborating evidence, further confirming the charges before you, as well as the president's willful dereliction of duty and desertion of duty as Commander-in-Chief of the United States, his state of mind, and his further incitement of the insurrection on January 6th. For that reason, and because this is the proper time to do so under the resolution that the Senate adopted to set the rules for the trial, we would like the opportunity to subpoena Congresswoman Herrera regarding her communications with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and to subpoena her contemporaneous notes that she made regarding what President Trump told Kevin McCarthy in the middle of the insurrection. We would be prepared to proceed by Zoom deposition of an hour or less, just as soon as Congresswoman Herrera Butler is available, and to then proceed to the next phase of the trial, including the introduction of that testimony shortly thereafter. Congresswoman Butler further stated that she hopes other witnesses to this part of the story, other patriots, as she put it, would come forward. And if that happens, we would seek the opportunity to take their depositions via Zoom, also for less than an hour, or to subpoena other relevant documents as well.
Ooh, can I get a witness? There was hope. And Trump's lawyers didn't like it at all. Here's his lawyer, Michael Vanderveen.
What you all need to know and the American people need to know is, as of late yesterday afternoon, there was a stipulation going around that there weren't going to be any witnesses. But after what happened here in this chamber yesterday, the House managers realized they did not investigate this case before bringing the impeachment. They did not give the proper consideration and work. They didn't put the work in that was necessary to impeach the former president. But if they want to have witnesses, I'm going to need at least over 100 depositions, not just one. The real issue is incitement. They put into their case over 100 witnesses, people who have been charged with crimes by the federal government. And each one of those, they said that Mr. Trump was a co-conspirator with. That's not true. But I have the right to defend that. The only thing that I ask, if you vote for witnesses, do not handcuff me by limiting the number of witnesses that I can have. I need to do a thorough investigation that they did not do.
And the demands got even more dramatic. Here's Trump's lawyer, Michael Van Der Veen.
Nancy Pelosi's deposition needs to be taken. Vice President Harris's deposition absolutely needs to be taken. And not by Zoom. None of these depositions should be done by Zoom. We didn't do this hearing by Zoom. These depositions should be done in person, in my office, in Philadelphia. That's where they should be done.
I mean, they just got so silly with the amount of busy work that they were threatening to do, the way they were threatening to stall the trial, that it made people laugh. Because in reality, this is what the Trump lawyers wanted.
We should close this case out today.
And so they put it to a vote. And the vote to have witnesses passed 55 to 45. And when I found that out, it was like game on. Until it wasn't. Because after that vote, there was chaos. And the impeachment managers disappeared into some back room somewhere and then made the decision to just say, fuck it to the whole witness thing. And so despite being granted a gift of getting an extension on the task of actually doing an investigation and making their case, they chose instead to settle for entering the new information into the record. And the information that they entered was hearsay.
I will now read the statement. This is the statement of Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, February 12, 2021. In my January 12th statement in support of the article of impeachment, I referenced a conversation House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy relayed to me that he'd had with President Trump while the January 6th attack was ongoing. Here are the details. When McCarthy finally reached the president on January 6th and asked him to publicly and forcefully call off the riot, the president initially repeated the falsehood that it was Antifa that had breached the Capitol. McCarthy refuted that and told the president that these were Trump supporters. That's when, according to McCarthy, the president said, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are."
But that wasn't according to McCarthy, because McCarthy wasn't the one who was giving the statement. It was someone that heard that McCarthy had said this to Trump, or Trump had said it. It was a person that wasn't on the goddamn call. This is information that we needed from Kevin McCarthy. And they didn't talk to him. They didn't interview him. They didn't subpoena him. Nothing. And then that was it. They just moved on to closing arguments. The end. And so as far as new facts are concerned, there was literally nothing new because they didn't do an investigation. They used public media reports. And if you listen to the Green Room impeachment episodes, you'll hear me lose my mind about the atrocious standards of evidence presented by the Democrats. They quoted things that weren't quotes. They ad-libbed right in the middle of what they were saying were quotes. They presented evidence from unnamed sources inside unsourced articles. They used sources in an impeachment trial that I wouldn't use on Congressional Dish. Instead of collecting evidence themselves and making sure they understood the events of that day, the House Impeachment Managers relied almost entirely upon stirring up the fear that the members of Congress felt on January 6th when they had to personally hide from the bumpkin mob. Now, I'm sure that day was terrifying for the members of Congress. You know, as for Jamie Raskin, the head House Impeachment Manager, he lost his son to suicide on New Year's Eve and then buried his son on January 5th. And so because they wanted to be together, he brought his family with him to the Capitol on January 6th. He brought the remaining family that he had and was separated from them when all this went down. He was afraid he was going to lose everyone that he had left. That's terrifying. Mike Pence also had his family with him, and Mike Pence was being personally called out by the Trump mob. And so you can understand all of their personal anger towards Donald Trump for inviting these people to Washington, D.C. Without Donald Trump telling these people that the election was stolen from them, this never would have happened. And I think we can all agree on that. Donald Trump is definitely at fault, and even Republicans, you heard Mitch McConnell, even Republicans acknowledge that. But as the trial wore on, as the Democrats spent hours reliving the riot, hours and hours of footage, their case went from kind of moving, and I could be empathetic to it, to super cringe. Because first of all, they strayed often from the facts. So here's one example. This is David Cicilline.
Senators, simply put, this mob was trying to overthrow our government.
On January 6th, Donald Trump was the president. And so his supporters were definitely not trying to overthrow his government. They were clearly trying to keep him in power. And there is a difference, and it matters in a trial. The House Impeachment Managers also engaged in wild speculation. Here's Joaquin Castro going all Russiagate.
According to charging documents, Riley Williams allegedly helped steal a laptop from Speaker Pelosi's office to, quote, send the computer device to a friend in Russia, who then planned to sell the device to SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. While we can't be certain if or how many foreign spies infiltrated the crowd, or at least coordinated with those who did, we can be sure that any enemy who wanted access to our secrets would have wanted to be part of that mob inside these halls.
We can't be certain if any of this happened, but let's throw it out there anyway. You know, if the goal is to convince Republican senators to convict, time warping back to the contentious Mueller report days is not the way to go. And this got so absurd that at one point they quoted an article that had quoted Senator Mark Lee, who, as a senator, was in the room. And when the House Impeachment Managers were done speaking, Senator Mike Lee jumped to his feet and said this.
Statements were attributed to me repeatedly, as to which I have personal knowledge because I am the source. They are not true. I never made those statements. I asked that they be stricken. This has nothing to do with whether or not they're based on depositions, which they're not. It's simply based on the fact that I'm the witness. I'm the only witness. Those statements are not true, and I ask that you strike them.
Which was a huge blow to their credibility. And it highlights a consistent problem with the way that the Democrats handled their case. They didn't collect any firsthand evidence. They didn't do their own interviews. They used media sources, and they didn't verify that those sources were correct. And in the middle of their trial, one of their supposed sources successfully got evidence removed from the trial because he himself was misquoted by the media. It so clearly demonstrated that the House managers didn't bother to do their homework. Instead, they hoped to get a conviction by making the senators mad all over again that they were the targets of the mob. But the melodrama, the exaggerations, it got real tough to stomach. And David Cicilline and Joaquin Castro were definitely the worst offenders.
He told them, remember this day forever. Hours after they marched through these halls looking to assassinate Vice President Pence, the Speaker of the House, and any of us they could find. This was a disaster of historic proportion. They could have killed all of us. Every time I read that tweet, it chills me to the core.
On January 6th, President Trump left everyone in this Capitol for dead.
The Democrats' case was all about them. The peasant mob targeted them personally, and they wanted someone to pay. With the case they brought, it made me even wonder if the impeachment would even have happened if the Capitol Police had held the line and kept the mob outside, and the members of Congress had not been personally affected. If that mob didn't get into the building, would Trump have been impeached for holding that rally and for what he said? Or was all of this happening because the bumpkins got in? The House Impeachment Managers chose to only file one article of impeachment, focused solely on the episode of The Trump Show that directly affected them. And in doing so, they missed the big picture. Because Trump's goal was clear, and it was clear before the riot. Trump attempted a self-coup. He made an attempt to keep himself in power despite losing the election. The riot was only one piece of that constitutional sin. The goal was to change the election result, and he worked on that for months, starting before the election even happened. Here's a montage that the House Impeachment Managers made. These clips are in chronological order, starting before the election and ending at the January 6th rally.
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the election?
I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. And this election will be the most rigged election in history. This is going to be the greatest election disaster in history. And the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election.
That's right. It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transfer of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
It's the only way we're going to. That's the only way we're going to lose, is if there's mischief, and it'll have to be on a big scale. So be careful.
But this will be one of the greatest most fraudulent elections ever.
We're not going to let this election be taken away from us. That's the only way they're going to win it. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret. And this is a case where they're trying to steal an election. They're trying to rig an election. And we can't let that happen.
You can't let another person steal that election from you. All over the country, people are together in holding up signs, "Stop the steal." If we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taken place in our 2020 election, we don't have a country anymore. We cannot allow a completely fraudulent election to stand. We're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now. If you don't fight to save your country with everything you have, you're not going to have a country left. We will not bend. We will not break. We will not yield. We will never give in. We will never give up. We will never back down. We will never, ever surrender.
He wanted to flip the election and to be declared the winner. Even at the rally, he made clear that that was his goal. He didn't lie about the election for months to cause the riot. That wasn't his game over. His intent on January 6th was clearly to publicly pressure members of Congress to get enough votes disqualified so that he would end up staying the president somehow. He was trying to influence the certification process. He lied publicly and got millions to believe him. He pressured public officials to throw away ballots, just enough to flip their states to him. He attempted to publicly bully his number two, Mike Pence, into somehow using power Trump thought he had to disqualify swing states from being counted. And he staged a protest outside the Capitol as a means to that end. A riot wasn't the goal. The goal was an election result flip. But that wasn't what he was impeached for. And he easily could have been if the impeachment article had just been structured a little bit differently. And in the actual article of impeachment, there were two events, not one, two events listed as Trump's sins: the Capitol riot and Trump's phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State. When I gave you the evidence at the end of the lame duck episode, you remember, I always thought that the Georgia call was the most obvious impeachable offense out of the two. And here's how the House Impeachment Managers handled the Georgia call during their presentation. This is House Impeachment Manager Madeline Dean.
And then in Georgia, a state Trump had counted on for victory, his conduct was perhaps the most egregious. On November 11th, Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger confirmed that he believed ballots were accurately counted for Biden. Trump went on a relentless attack. Here are just a few examples. In all, Trump tweeted at Raffensperger 17 times in the coming week. I'll show you just a few. Calling him a disaster, obstinate, not having a clue, being played for a fool, and being a so-called Republican. All because Raffensperger was doing his job, ensuring the integrity of our elections.
And here's what they said about the call.
In early December, Trump called Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and pressured him to hold a special session of the state legislature to overturn the election results and to appoint electors who would vote for Trump. A few weeks later, on December 23rd, Trump called the chief investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, who was conducting an audit of the signature matching procedures for absentee ballots. Trump urged him, find the fraud, and claimed the official would be a national hero if he did. Let's call this what it is. He was asking the official to say there was evidence of fraud when there wasn't any. The official refused, and the investigation was completed. And on December 29th, Raffensperger announced that the audit found, quote, no fraudulent absentee ballots with a 99% confidence level. On January 3rd, Trump tweeted about a call he had with a Georgia election official the day before. He said, and I quote, I spoke to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January the 5th, the Washington Post released a recording of that call, which had occurred on January 2nd. Remember, just 4 days before the attack on the Capitol. Here is what President Trump said.
It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyers. That's a big risk.
Let's be clear. This is the President of the United States telling a Secretary of State that if he does not find votes, he will face criminal penalties. And not just any number of votes. Donald Trump was asking the Secretary of State to somehow find the exact number of votes Donald Trump lost the state by. Remember, President Biden won Georgia by 11,779 votes. In his own words, Trump said, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes. He wanted the Secretary of State to somehow find the precise number plus one so that he could win. Here's what he said.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
He says it right there. The President of the United States telling a public official to manufacture the exact votes needed so he can win.
It's so clear. And she did a good job explaining it. But it's so clear that Trump isn't trying to get the Georgia Secretary of State to make sure their numbers are accurate. It's so clear that he's trying to flip just enough votes so that he wins. He was the most powerful person on earth, the head law enforcement officer in this country. And so when he calls and threatens a dude with legal action, that threat is not benign. But while they played videos of the rioters over and over and over again for hours, this was the only time they played any portions of that phone call. They focused on the actions of hundreds of people who were not Donald Trump for hours and treated the evidence they had of Trump himself, of his actions, as a side issue. And just for the record, here's the best defense to that his lawyers could come up with for his conduct on that call. Here is Bruce Castor, Trump's lawyer.
The House managers told you that the president demanded that the Georgia Secretary of State, quote, find just over 11,000 votes. The word find, like so many others the House managers highlighted, is taken completely out of context. And the word find did not come out of thin air. Based on an analysis of publicly available voter data that the ballot rejection rate in Georgia in 2016 was approximately 6.42%. And even though a tremendous amount of new first-time mail-in ballots were included in the 2020 count, the Georgia rejection rate in 2020 was a mere 0.4%, a drop-off from 6.42% to 0.4%.
Numbers which appear to be pure bullshit. Because he's comparing the overall ballot rejection rate from 2016, which includes rejection for late ballots, envelopes with no signatures, signature mismatches, like everything. He's comparing that rate to the rejection rate for signature mismatches alone in 2020. When you compare the numbers that represent the same thing, signature mismatches, In 2016, there was a 0.24% rejection rate compared to a 0.15% rejection rate for 2020. That is not a big difference. And when it comes to the specifics of his numbers, no one seems to know where Castro got 0.4% from, and he did not offer a source. But here's the summary of their defense for that phone call.
With that background, it is clear that President Trump's comments and the use of the word find were solely related to his concerns with the inexplicable dramatic drop in Georgia's ballot rejection rates.
But there was no dramatic drop, and so the word find probably means exactly what it sounds like. You know, do what you have to do to find just enough votes to flip to me so that I win your state. The crime is so clear. And Trump is under criminal investigation in the state of Georgia for, and you know what? Here's the list from the Georgia prosecutor. Quote, potential violations of Georgia law prohibiting the solicitation of election fraud, the making of false statements to state and local government bodies, conspiracy, racketeering, violation of oath of office, and any involvement in violence or threats related to the elections administration, unquote. But the Democrats, they chose to treat all of that as a side issue instead of the strongest evidence against Donald Trump that they had. And that kind of makes sense in this particular impeachment trial because that phone call was not evidence that Trump incited an insurrection. They focused on all of Trump's behavior as if the goal was the riot. But again, that wasn't his goal. And there are so many things that the House Impeachment Managers could have charged Donald Trump with. Dereliction of duty, incitement of violence or a riot, didn't have to be insurrection. Solicitation of election fraud, as prosecutors in Georgia are now investigating. Intentional interference with the performance of election duties. But they chose only incitement of insurrection, an extreme charge, something that Trump's lawyers jumped all over. Here's Michael Vanderveen.
This is an article of impeachment for incitement. This is not an article of impeachment for anything else. It's a one count. They could have charged anything they wanted. They chose to charge incitement.
And that one charge was always going to be tough to prove because of what they chose to say he incited. Here's Bruce Castor, Trump's lawyer.
Did the 45th president engage in incitement of, they continue to say, insurrection? Clearly, there was no insurrection. Insurrection is a term of art defined in the law. It involves taking over a country, a shadow government, taking the TV stations over, and having some plan on what you're going to do when you finally take power. Clearly, this is not that. What our colleagues here across the aisle meant is incitement to violence, to riot.
Kobe! You know, that argument was an easy layup for Trump's lawyers. You know, was the more accurate charge of incitement of a riot not dramatic enough of a charge for the Democrats? Why did they have to take the charge a step further and label it an insurrection? Which in case law has been interpreted to mean that the purpose of the violence is overthrowing the government and seizing its powers. Trump was the head of the government on January 6th. His supporters weren't trying to overthrow him. It just doesn't fit. But they didn't take any time to hold any hearings with constitutional lawyers to craft the article of impeachment. They wrote it while their emotions were still running high in the days after the riot, and it was sloppy. Because in the trial, they did identify Trump's true crime many times. Here's Joaquin Castro.
He intended, wanted to, and tried to overturn the election by any means necessary. He tried everything else that he could to do to win. He started inciting the crowd, issuing tweet after tweet, issuing commands to stop the count, stop the steal, worked up the crowd, sent a save the date. So it wasn't just one speech or one thing. He was trying everything. He was pressuring elected officials. He was riling up his base, telling them the election had been stolen from them, that it had been stolen from him. It was a combination of things that only Donald Trump could have done.
But here's Trump's lawyer, Michael Vanderveen.
Because their case is so weak, the House managers have taken a kitchen sink approach to the supposedly single article of impeachment. They allege that Mr. Trump incited the January 6th violence. They allege that he abused power by attempting to pressure Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger to undermine the results of the 2020 election. And they allege that he gravely and endangered the democratic system by interfering with the peaceful transition of power. There's at least three things there. Under the Senate rules, each of these allegations must have been alleged in a separate article of impeachment.
He's right. Had the article they filed just been split into separate charges, that would have given the senators a menu of impeachable offenses to choose from. An appetizer of influencing election officials, a main course of inciting a riot, and an aperitif of interfering with the peaceful transition of power. But instead, they just flopped a sloppy Joe charge on the table and told the senators to take it or leave it. Incitement of insurrection, a charge commanding violence to overthrow the government. It was an unnecessarily high bar that they simply couldn't clear. And there seems to be a common wisdom floating around that it really doesn't matter what they charged him with anyway, because no matter what they charged, the Republicans were never going to vote to convict. So, fuck it, who cares? But I don't buy that, because on January 6th, the overwhelming majority of Republican senators did not side with Donald Trump to help him to flip the election to himself, even though success in that effort would have meant 4 more years of increased power for their party and therefore themselves. Only 7 shameful Republican senators used their votes to help Trump. Most Republican senators were not on board and did not approve of Trump's attempts to flip the election. You heard Mitch McConnell. And Republican senators have proven that they follow McConnell's lead. But the Democrats didn't focus on the offense that the Senate was 93% united in fury about on January 6th, the attempt to flip the election. Instead, they picked one charge, incitement of insurrection, the one thing that Trump really didn't appear to do. Because before the riot, he recommended a heavy police presence. And his words at the rally indicate he intended to encourage a march, not a riot. And during the riot, we still don't really know for sure what he did because of the no investigation that the House Impeachment Managers conducted. And so now that I've lost all of my tribal Republican listeners, now I guess it's time to experience the wrath of tribal Democrats again, because even though I know that Donald Trump is guilty as sin of trying to flip enough results of the election so that he's the winner, which I think should disqualify him from becoming president again because he has proven that he will not transfer power responsibly. In Trump's second impeachment trial, just like the first, the Democrats have put me in the position of having to say that if I were a senator, I would have voted to acquit the fucker. Again. The Democrats didn't make the case because they brought the wrong one. And now, there are only 2 things preventing Donald Trump from becoming president again. One of them is us. And so hopefully his behavior after the election is repulsive enough that he won't be voted back into power. But 74 million of us voted for him in 2020, so I don't understand us. I don't have a lot of hope in us, really, in any way at this moment. And so then there's also the other option, which is that Trump is prevented from running because his criminal ass is put behind bars. For something, anything, corrupt business practices, campaign finance violations, paying off Stormy Daniels, Georgia's prosecution for all of this election flipping shit. Any of those will do. And here's what Mitch McConnell said.
Indeed, Justice Story specifically reminded that while former officials were not eligible for impeachment or conviction, they were, and this is extremely important, still liable to be tried and punished in the ordinary tribunals of justice. Put another way, in the language of today, President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he's in office. Didn't get away with anything yet.
And so the Trump show is to be continued. And as for Congressional Dish, producers asked me to create this episode because I wanted to stay out of it and move on from the Trump show. But now that the episode is done, knowing that once the Trump administration is further in the rearview mirror, that people who tuned out of the news as a coping mechanism for getting through 2020 and the Trump administration, a phenomenon that's already beginning. People that just couldn't handle listening to the show are coming back now. I do think that having this episode in the record on the internet to explain the trial for those who want to look back on it, I think it's important. And I'm glad that I did this episode because I want people to know why this trial played out the way it did. I think this will be historically useful. And so I am happy that I listened and did this work. But I know the wrath of the Democrats is coming. I know I'm about to get mass fired by people who are mad at Trump, don't do nuance, and will be mad at me for, I don't know, they'll just be mad at me. If you heard my episode about the first Trump impeachment, you know that I've been through this before. Dealing with the emotions of others during the Trump years was unpleasant. Unpleasant to the extent that in 2017, I was real close to quitting this job. And I think I'm in for one more round of emotional firings before this is truly over because of what I just said in this episode. And so if you support my work and my honesty, because it would be so much easier to just say Trump bad, they should have convicted him regardless of the strength of the case. If you support my masochistic refusal to say the easy things and to tell you the truth instead, please pay for this show to make up for the inevitable firings that are coming from the partisans who don't. And if you do that, if you do pay for the show, you will be incentivizing me to keep creating episodes, giving you my sources, and saying the hard things. And you, in return, will not only have future Congressional Dish episodes to look forward to, but you can also have your feedback read to the entire community in a bonus thank you episode, along with your new Patreon pledge or Venmo payment or email that accompanies a paper check. I read all the feedback. And to that end, if you would like your feedback shared on a main episode, which gets about double the audience of thank you episodes, you can pay for a significant portion of an episode's production costs and become an executive producer for $535 or more. And that's cumulative. So if you're paying regularly, just let me know when you hit $535. We'll verify it and you can put your credit on whatever episode you're proudest to produce. And so right now, I would like to thank two of our new executive producers. So thank you to our anonymous executive producer who said, love your podcast. Your work on the WTO is what hooked me in. And for those of you not in the know, that's the World Trade Organization. And says, thank you for all your hard work. And the episode that this anonymous executive producer picked was the nuclear waste storage episode. That's where they decided to put their credit. And they said it was because that was super interesting. So thank you so much for supporting this show and for becoming an executive producer. I'm really happy to have a credit listed on that one because I found that information super interesting too. And then also, I would like to thank our new executive producer, Sarah Judd. And she sent in an email that said, hi, Jen. I've been a listener of your show since a friend shared Congressional Dish episode 182, Justice Kavanaugh. Please forgive the dramatics, but in a world inundated with political podcasters spouting their mostly shitty opinions, your show quickly became a lifeline for me. A little bit on who I am. I grew up in the Florida Panhandle and work in public health/medicine. I've always been a bit of a government nerd. Even though community health is my jam, I majored in history for funsies, good word, as an undergrad, focusing on U.S. Cold War economic and foreign policy. Since finishing my undergrad in 2014, I struggled to find a bridge between American history and current affairs. Your episodes are a lot like the lectures I received in my major, the most valuable piece being the tools you give your listeners to seek this information out on their own. I agree. The show notes are the most important thing I do. Back to her note, she said, so when Congressional Dish 182 showed up in my messages, it felt like a long lost piece of the puzzle finally coming into place. I recently upped my contribution to $30 an episode, and that's on Patreon, and thank you for doing that, and provided a lump sum contribution that I think qualifies me for an executive producer spot. While 182 is what brought us together, I can't bear to have my name so close to Brett Kavanaugh's, and so I would like to request an executive producer credit for Congressional Dish 210, The Afghanistan War. It's one of my absolute favorites. Thank you for all you do. Cheers, Sarah Judd. Well, thank you, Sarah, for supporting this show and becoming an executive producer. If you liked the Afghanistan War episode, I think you're going to like what I have coming up for you. Maybe not the content of it, but the next episode I'm going to be working on is war stuff. because it's time for me to read the NDAA and look into what was actually funded when it comes to wars. And as I'm recording this, I am actually getting blown up on Instagram and in my emails because Joe Biden just bombed Syria. It only took him a month. So I think this is a good time to be looking into what is authorized in matters of war. So yeah, thank you to all executive producers. Thank you to all producers. I do love this job. Despite the world of shit I know I have coming for me, I do love this job. So thank you for making it possible for me to do this very important work. Yeah, so I will talk to you all soon. I'll have a thank you episode out for you. I'm still like watching hearings and stuff, so don't be surprised if before the war episode is done, if I pop in with a hearing related episode, because like I said in this episode, or at least I think I mentioned, there were some hearings this week about the Capitol riot from the people that I feel like should have been witnesses in the trial. And so I'm going to watch those for funsies. And so if I find anything interesting or new, don't be surprised if I pop in with an extra episode for you before I finish the war stuff, because that's going to take me a while. Right now, I'm only scheduled to do one episode in March because reading thousands of pages of legislation takes a fucking long time. So I need, I need some research time for this next one. So yeah, congressionaldish.com is where you can pay me and find the show notes. Until I talk to you next, I love you all. That's about it. All right. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.